Today we're going to be working on another shell-like creature. If you watch the video on the mussel bed, you may have noticed it off in the corner there. It's called a nautilus. And this is something that I considered including when we were working on the tentacles, but I decided that there was already enough going on in that month, so I've deferred it to now, and here it is. A nautilus is a creature that lives in a spiral-shaped shell. It definitely has tentacles that sometimes emerge from the shell. You can either include them or not this month if you want. So to make my nautilus, I've cut out this basic teardrop shaped piece of cloth. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch down the edge starting at the point using my usual 2, or if you wanted it to be more prominent you could use 3 lines of contrasting thread using what's called a blanket stitch. Now this stitch will secure down the edge off the fabric, but it'll also create those lines that you see on the nautilus shell as well. So it's a really kind of 2 for 1 there. You get it sewn down, but you also get the pattern as well. So I will stitch these around in a circle. It'll go in a spiral. Now if you're used to sewing blanket stitch along a straight line, you'll have to make a slight adjustment here to go around in a circle. So the spokes of your blanket stitch are going to have to, instead of being parallel, they're all going to be pointing towards the center point. Like the spokes of the wheel point towards the center, these also need to point towards the center. If you want this to look fairly realistic, you don't want all of your spokes to be the same length. You want some of them to be longer, some of them to be shorter, and vary them as you're going around so that you're not going long, short, long, short. You're doing this quite randomly. Sometimes you'll do 2 shorter ones, one shorter than the other, and then you'll do a long one, and then you'll do a medium-sized one. So it is actually really hard to do that. Doing things randomly is difficult. You can also vary the spacing between them. You can have some that are closer together and some that are a little bit further apart, and you will find, again, if you are a beginner, sometimes that comes naturally, but if you're an experienced stitcher, you'll find that it's very hard to do things irregularly. So again, I mentioned this in the mussel video, but I'll say it again. Sometimes being experienced and being very, very skilled at doing something is not necessarily an advantage when you're trying to make things look realistic. So being a beginner, this is actually something that you'll be better at when you're trying to make something look like it's a natural object rather than a plastic imitation. And then as you start to go around the curve, you'll see what I mean, because if I had those spokes all going straight down, then they would run off the edge there. But I want them to be pointing vaguely, not precisely, but vaguely towards the center of the piece of cloth that I have there. And one of the reasons that I really wanted to include this creature, even though they're not very common, is that I learned about them from a video, and I don't even remember where that was because it was several months ago, that said that they are able to mend their shells. If their shell becomes damaged, they can repair it visibly. So they are the original visible menders. So I thought that in the spirit of hand sewing and mending and what have you, I thought that this was a beautiful mascot for my scroll here, and I really wanted to include it. It's also quite a fun shape to stitch. As I come around and I'm getting back to that flat part of the teardrop, I'm going to start veering off from the outside edge of the cloth to make my spiral inward. I'm going to still keep doing those blanket stitches. They're just not going to be at the very edge of the cloth. And it's it's just sort of a matter of personal preference when you start to veer into the cloth there to make a nice circular shape. And if you wanted to, you could draw the spiral on ahead of time. I tend not to do that because I just like to let things emerge as they will. But if it was easier for you, you could draw that spiral to follow along rather than try to figure it out just with your stitches there. So I've left a little bit of the flat edge there open, and we'll come back to that a bit later. But for now, what I'm doing is spiraling in with my blanket stitches, and still thinking about doing it irregularly, but sometimes I can only focus on one thing at a time. And at this point, I'm more focused on getting that spiral to work out. You might find that the spokes off your blanket stitch need to get a little bit shorter, and the spacing between the stitches needs to be a little bit closer together in order to get those tight curves there. And watch the spacing and watch how tightly you pull. And if your stitches start to look a little funny, don't worry about it too much. It'll just add variety and interest to your shell. It does not have to be perfect. And you know, there are two different directions that your spiral can go in. If you think of a analog clock, an old-fashioned clock, the way that the hands turn clockwise or counterclockwise, and I didn't even bother to look up whether an actual Nautilus, which way it goes. And so I'm spiraling in a clockwise direction. So it may be that an actual Nautilus would have a shell that spirals in a counterclockwise direction. I don't actually know. And if it's important to you, you can look it up and find out. But I have to tell you, this Nautilus is well out of scale with my piece, which I don't mind at all, because if you create big things, they look closer to you, and then the smaller things look like they're further away. So this is, again, creating a sense of a depth in my underwater garden that I've got growing here. And this Nautilus is just very, very close, and everything else is further away. So there you go. I'm almost towards the center. And when I don't have enough room, when I run out of room and I can't comfortably fit any more stitches in there in my spiral, that's when I'll know it's time to stop. I'll just go as far as I can towards the middle, and then I will stop. And it's created a very kind of cool looking seashell there, seashell-like shape there. And I think that looks pretty good. So now you have a choice at this point. You could decide that you're just going to sew down the flat edge of the shell that didn't get caught up in the spiral there and call it done, and your Nautilus could be done. But I'm going to take it one step further and actually create the some tentacles that are coming out of my shell. So I've switched to a light pink color thread that I think will be a good color for the tentacles, and I'm using that to stitch down the open edge there. And now I'm going to use stem stitch, which will create some nice bulky straight lines there to create my tentacles that are emerging from the shell. So they will all be going in roughly the same direction, but there could be some variety, but basically they're poking out through that straight line there. So I'm going to make them roughly perpendicular to that line to create the tentacles. And you could make your tentacles as long or as bulky as you like, or they could be fine and delicate. It's really up to you how you want to do them. Or, as I said, you don't have to include these at all. You could just make the shell, and that could be it. Maybe the tentacles are pulled inside, or they're no longer inside your creature. So it's really up to you how you want to approach this part. So I'm just going to make many tentacles, straight lines coming out using stem stitch, which is forward and back, overlapping the stitch a bit. And if you're not sure, you can certainly go back and review some of the other videos, or find a tutorial online for this stitch if you need some more guidance. And if you like, let me know and I can put up one of the tutorials that I have for creating the stitch that I've used in some of the other videos that we've done. But again, like I said, I run into tangled and threads all the time and I just don't let it bother me. You know, if you really need things to happen quickly, then this type of stitching is probably not a great way to spend your time. But if you're willing to just let it take whatever time it wants and let things emerge as they will, then I think this is quite a pleasant and fun way to spend my time. Just the other day, I had somebody at my social stitching group who didn't want to do any hand sewing. She'll just come into the group, cut things out, and then go home and sew them by machine because she really doesn't like the idea of spending the time to sew by hand. But I can see that all the perfectionism gets in her way of finishing things. So, you know, different people have different personalities, so it's really up to you how you want to spend your time. I quite enjoy doing this. I really love to see these beautiful things emerge just with some bits of thread and cloth in my hands. And there it is. There's my finished Nautilus. And here's a slightly closer view of what it looks like. Once again, thanks for watching and happy stitching. I will see you again soon. Bye for now.